For over 65 years, Eastern Airlines had grown from a humble mail carrier to a massive mainstream airline in the United States, providing international service with a fleet of hundreds of aircraft. It was an innovative and forward-thinking company, being the launch customer for various state-of-the-art airplanes. But it was also one plagued with crushing financial pressure, one which would cease operations by the early 90s. So let's take a deeper look into this once iconic brand and find out why it ultimately declared bankruptcy. In November of 1924, a man named Harold Frederick Pitcairn started the Pitcairn Aircraft Company. Harold founded this company with the intent on building planes for the increasingly lucrative United States mail services. His company would develop various models of mailing aircraft, most of which were small piston-engine biplanes that sold decently well, notably the PA-5 mail wing. The company had also grown into flying the mail themselves, and this presented a great opportunity to investors, one of which was a Canadian financier who personally bought the corporation and proceeded to turn around and sell it to another private party, the North American Aviation Company. They would continue and amp up the mail service operations, and rename the brand to Eastern Air Transport, named after the region the carrier had been serving. They would continue to fly mail under government contracts through the early 1930s. However, after the 1934 Airmail Act, which saw the majority of private carriers have their contracts revoked, the company had to pivot. General Motors would purchase the corporation and rename it to Eastern Airlines, now focusing primarily on passenger service. And that service reached pretty far, flying the Douglas DC-2 and DC-3 to major cities like New York, Miami, and Houston. General Motors would only own the company for a brief period though, as they would ultimately sell it to a man named Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie was a fighter pilot in World War I, a literal flying ace who also held the Medal of Honor. Not only was he a successful and well-regarded war veteran, but he was also a savvy businessman who had a passion for the growing aviation industry as well as motor vehicles. With those passions, he found himself as a ranking executive within the General Motors company, and he became involved in their aviation division, ultimately overseeing their ownership of Eastern. Eddie would later convince GM to divest their stake in the company to him, as he would purchase Eastern in 1938 for $3.5 million, or around $77 million today. Eddie would make himself the president of this now independent company, and he would push for major growth. Eastern Airlines would grow their fleet of DC-3s by quite a high margin, branding them as the Great Silver Fleet. After World War II, the company continued to flourish, capitalizing on the growing demand for air travel while also investing in new aircraft types that could fly further and hold more passengers. Eastern Airlines would begin flying the Martin 404, the DC-6 and 7, as well as the Lockheed Constellation. To expand their routes even further, they would purchase Colonial Airlines and provide international service flying to Mexico, Bermuda, and Canada. This massive expansion of both their fleet and routes put the airline in a dominant, almost monopolistic position on the East Coast, as they became the most profitable airline in the entire country. By the late 1950s, the industry was evolving even further with the advent of jet-powered aircraft, but Eastern began lagging behind. It turns out that Rickenbacker wasn't all too interested in the future of jets, and was reluctant to purchase them. The passenger experience was also hindered a little bit by his later management style, which was a little more frugal despite the airline being marketed as a premium experience. Rickenbacker would ultimately be replaced by a new CEO. The airline would begin bringing on their first jets. Rickenbacker was fine though, and I suggest you read up on his story because he is a fascinating person. Not only was he a war hero, but he also survived adrift at sea for over 21 days. Then he obviously became a successful executive owning an airline, but he also survived a plane crash on an Eastern Airlines plane in which he was one of only 8 people who lived. Anyways, the company under new leadership opened up more frequent, non-stop routes between major cities on the East Coast, and they had done work to improve the in-flight experience, returning to the perception that Eastern was a step above the rest. They continued to prove that by the very aircraft they were putting into service. Eastern was a launch customer of the Boeing 727, an aircraft that they were calling the Whisper Jet, marketing it as the quietest airplane in the sky with superb onboard food. Short commuter hops were still a large part of Eastern's routes though, So the company created a new brand that would operate those shorter flights called Eastern Airlines Shuttle. By the mid-1960s, the mainline brand was also freshening up, with new uniforms for their crew as well as a fleet-wide livery update, now sporting the new Eastern Billboard brand along with the nicknamed hockey stick logo. By the 70s, the company had expanded its route system even further, now becoming the obvious choice for many flying on the eastern seaboard, including destinations in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, while some nonstop flights reached as far west as Los Angeles and Seattle. Walt Disney World had also opened by this time, and Eastern Airlines became the official airline of the Central Florida resort. In fact, the company even sponsored a whole attraction at the Magic Kingdom called If You Had Wings. Eastern was also growing into wide-body, long-range aircraft now. They temporarily leased 3 747s for a few years, while they ramped up capacity for the brand new L-1011, a wide-body aircraft which they were again the launch customer for. Eastern would also invest in the new European airplane manufacturer Airbus. They would spend more than $770 million to purchase a fleet of new A300 aircraft, the first North American company to do so. With these new jets, the airline really honed in on making the passenger experience even more comfortable, emphasizing great customer service and premium onboard experiences. Their L-1011, for example, had a dedicated galley on the bottom deck, along with wider seats and a more spacious cabin. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing for the company. Just after 4 months since the brand took delivery of their 10th L-1011, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Florida Everglades after a distracted flight crew unknowingly disconnected the aircraft's autopilot and ran it into the ground. The crash killed 101 people, while 2 years later in 1974, Eastern Flight 212 crashed in Charlotte, North Carolina as a result of crew errors again. The accident killed 72 passengers, including Stephen Colbert's father and 2 brothers. Several months after that, yet another crash occurred, Flight 66. It went down due to a wind shear event at JFK Airport. At the time, it was the deadliest crash in US history, killing 113 people. These accidents were highly publicized and certainly not a good look for the brand. But on top of this, they were also struggling with logistical and financial problems too. All of their new wide-body jets meant that the company would need to hire more mechanics and purchase more service equipment. It also meant more fuel, and in the 1970s, fuel was very expensive. With airline deregulation, Eastern was forced to be more competitive, and that meant in order to stay competitive in a market with lots of competition, they would need to lower fares. But with all of their new expenses, their margins were razor thin. In order to stay competitive, the airline was just not making any profit. Eastern would just squeeze by through this time, barely making it through this tumultuous era, avoiding a possible bankruptcy. By the early 1980s, things did improve, and the company would expand outside their comfort zone, now flying direct out of Atlanta to several European cities, like Brussels and London. After purchasing the now bankrupt Braniff's route network, they also expanded south, flying routes to South America. But flying out of Atlanta directly competed with Delta, but neither airline was a clear winner of this route war. By passenger volume and the sheer size of their fleet, Eastern had now become the 3rd largest airline in the US, transporting passengers more than 32 million miles annually. The company would also take delivery of a few more brand new aircraft, like the DC-10 as well as the new Boeing 757, which they were again the launch customer of. They would also change some of their liveries to a more chromatic one that saved on weight. But the company was also still struggling financially, seeing tens of millions of dollars lost each year through the mid-80s. They also had a high debt load with hefty interest payments. But then came Frank Lorenzo, an industry veteran and someone who had been on the lookout to absorb these struggling airlines and turn them around, something he had already done with Continental. So under his holding company called Texas Air Corporation, he purchased Eastern Airlines for $615 million, or around $1.7 billion today. That was a bargain for an airline the size of Eastern. European service was cut down to just a singular route, from Miami to London, while the company overall declined dramatically in the number of passengers, as some of their older planes in the fleet were sold off. The comparatively stronger United and American Airlines were able to compete with Eastern in both the routes served and pricing, while budget-focused airlines like Southwest were chipping at the heels of Eastern. Lorenzo structured his whole business strategy around lowering fares, and on his quest to do that, he reduced premium aspects of the in-flight service while also demanding lower wages for employees, in some cases asking for 20 to 40% wage cuts. Apparently, all of this was done to allow the airline to offer lower consumer prices, but also find a path to profitability. Obviously, Eastern's longtime employees weren't happy about this, and labor union disruptions became an ongoing problem for corporate. To shave off even more overhead and earn some cash, Lorenzo decided to sell off the shuttle subsidiary of the company. It was a section of the business that did work, and some saw it as a corporate raid to sell off valuable parts of the company while they still could. Regardless, he ended up selling this brand to Donald Trump of all people for $365 million. The company would be rebranded to Trump Shuttle, but would ultimately shut down in just under 3 years, never once making a profit. Eastern's mainline brand was likewise struggling to earn money as well. Press articles about their financial hardship and generally bad experiences aboard their aircraft were relentless, and in 1988, the Department of Transportation discovered multiple safety violations, imposing a nearly $10 million fine, the largest ever dealt to an airline at the time. Not only was the company losing customers to a poor brand perception and to stiff competition, but internally, the brand was struggling with keeping their employees happy, or even properly compensated. Many integral employee subsets had seen multiple pay reductions and poor treatment by management. Worse news yet for employees came later in 1988, as the company announced they would be laying off thousands of longtime workers. The company would often blame their hardships on labor, while employees would blame management. And it makes sense why, as many felt that once Lorenzo bought the corporation, their treatment had significantly declined. Corporate claimed that pay cuts were the only way to save the company, while union leaders prepared letters proposing that the company could cut costs in other areas of the business. Those letters went unanswered. 3 separate labor unions, the ground crews, flight attendants, and crucially pilots, all failed negotiations with management. This ultimately reached a boiling point and caused them to go on strike in early 1989, a massive disruption to the company's operations. The company by this point was operating basically on cash from ticket sales they had for future flights. But when flights were canceled and customers began asking for refunds, Eastern's very little liquid cash evaporated. In the final years of the 1980s, talks of bankruptcy seem to have always been mentioned when talking about the battered airline. Despite all of the downsizing and even the elimination of many of their western routes, clearly it was just too late. Just days after the unions had gone on strike, on March 9th, 1989, Eastern Airlines had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Initially, there was hope that a buyer for the company could be found, but it soon became clear that that wouldn't happen. The company, after all, was in over $2.5 billion in debt, equivalent to a staggering $6.2 billion today. I mean, the company was in a deep, deep hole. But management and even union leaders all went on TV and stated very clearly that it was their intent and hope that Eastern could reemerge out of this bankruptcy and see a future beyond this mess.
We are calling on every possible force in this country that has any conscience, including the flying public, to be sure that Frank Lorenzo and this atrocity that he has perpetrated does not succeed.
This wasn't totally meritless though, as the company was bringing in some cash by selling parts of their operations. Eastern sold aircraft and gates at airports, while also using the money they got from selling their shuttle service. The company began returning passenger revenue flights by the end of that year, returning service to the East Coast as well as South America. By early 1990 though, Lorenzo had lost his grip on the company, and a new CEO was instituted by a bankruptcy judge to lead the company. Lorenzo had left the company with a $30 million golden parachute. Despite the airline still in bankruptcy protection and operating almost as normal, they still hadn't found a way to restructure their enormous debt, and the company was still losing money on day-to-day operations. Despite Lorenzo being ousted, he was still being blamed for the mess that they were in, both from the press and from many within the unions. The overall company had shrunk significantly, and Eastern had already lost another $850 million in just 1 year. To make matters even worse, fuel prices were once again soaring due to the Persian Gulf War, and their debt had sunk even deeper to over $3 billion, or around $6.6 billion today. I think it was obvious that the company wasn't going to emerge from their deeply troubled position. And with rising costs and no buyers coming in, Eastern Airlines had shut down at midnight on January 19th, 1991. All flights thereafter were canceled, and over 20,000 employees would lose their jobs. Delta and American Airlines vowed to honor some ticket holders for future Eastern flights, just as the companies signed papers for their Chapter 7 liquidation. With union tensions never resolved, a bankruptcy court began stripping the company for parts, in some cases quite literally. Auctions across the country would be held, selling everything from maintenance parts to entire aircraft. The remaining fleet was sold off here and there, while many were just retired and scrapped. The death of Eastern was profoundly sad for thousands of airline employees, not only because they had worked there for decades, but also because they were entering the new world of the airline industry, one that was a lot worse off. Many who lost their jobs had a hard time finding work, and those who did choose to work in the industry again found that wages had been significantly reduced. Again, this is all while executives took home millions as they exited the failed company. Even Eastern's attraction at Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom had closed. It did so just before they declared bankruptcy, and it switched to a Delta-sponsored attraction called Delta Dreamflight. But that's not the end of the Eastern brand per se. While it did dissolve afterwards and everyone sort of forgot about it, in 2009, the intellectual property for the brand would be purchased by a company looking to restart the airline. Obviously, it was a completely new entity, but they did restart in 2015 with 6 737s that were on various small routes and charter flights. They flew these aircraft in the classic livery, which was cool. However, the company would cease operations after they were acquired in 2017. This new company would relaunch the airline again in 2018, now formatting it with long-haul aircraft like 6 767s and 9 777s. They would temporarily use the classic livery on their 767s until moving to a weird hybrid one, while their 777s would take on an entirely new livery with a completely new brand image associated. They would finally take to the skies with their inaugural flight in early 2020, perhaps the worst time to launch an airline. Obviously, they would struggle thereafter, refocusing on cargo rather than passengers, and just flying a lonely route between Florida and the Dominican Republic. Reviews for the airline were not great, and cargo seems to be the primary focus of the airline today. But that seems to be the general path this brand has gone down time and time again. Despite its humble roots and fascinating characters coming in to grow the airline to what it ultimately became, Eastern was really only a successful carrier when it had no real competition. It was both incredibly profitable and a great way to fly across the East Coast back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Despite it being an iconic and well-known brand thereafter, it also struggled enormously to keep planes in the air. From the deregulation to the oil crisis in the 70s, the airline was hurting. But after a massive increase of competition, a dilution of their premium experience, a general perception of unsafe operations, management who were trying to cut as many corners as possible, and a massively angry workforce because of it, well, this just all worked against the airline's future. Eastern stood no chance by the early 90s, and its bankruptcy seemed inevitable for years. Really, once Eastern was purchased by Lorenzo and his holding company, they changed the core operating structure of the business and split their efforts between Eastern and Continental. They fundamentally changed how the business was run, and they saddled Eastern with more debt and higher interest rates to go along with it. And there definitely weren't many within the corporation that liked how its future was being handled. So really, it's no wonder why it couldn't succeed. Even after being resurrected twice, it still couldn't survive long term. At the end of the day, this once massive and iconic brand ultimately fell from the sky, and as it turns out, it would never take off again.